bunch of individually packaged newts. Thanks, Draco. Rigel smiled like he'd just solved Merlin's paradox. Draco did not immediately forgive the boy for wasting his time. As Rigel paid for his ingredients and the two of them started back toward the castle, Draco heaved a mental sigh of disappointment. It looked like his friend was more wily than he'd thought. He was a Slytherin, for all that sometimes he seemed more like a Ravenclaw. He supposed it was only right that it be hard to catch him out. Still, Draco had all semester. He would leave the tracker in Rigel's shoe, even if it did seem to be a bit glitchy. Eventually, he would figure out what had his friend so secretive. That is, more secretive than usual. -0. HP. -0. Rigel had no idea what was making Draco act so oddly while they were in Hogsmeade, but she was ready for an hour or so of quiet when she got back to the castle. She left the common room, which was pretty rowdy that Saturday, in favor of heading to the library, where quiet was guaranteed thanks to Madame Pin's stringently consistent enforcement habits. She had been planning to read some more of Dumbledore's handwritten textbook that afternoon, but when she caught sight of Ginny scribbling away at a corner table she was reminded of a question she'd been meaning to ask the girl. Rigel made her way over and waited patiently while Ginny finished the paragraph she was working on. "To what do I owe this honor?" the redhead said, propping her chin on one hand in a parody of interest. "Do you have a minute?" Rigel asked. "I wanted to get your thoughts on something I'm working on." "I suppose," Ginny said, clearing her parchment and quill off to the side. "It's not like this charms essay was going to win any awards." "I'm sure it's very good," Rigel said politely. "I'm sure you're full of crap, like usual." Ginny smiled sweetly. Ignoring her confrontational conversational style, Rigel sat across from the girl. "How is your occlumency coming along, if I may ask?" Immediately, she was on guard. "Why? I've been working on mine, and I'm having creative difficulties," Rigel admitted. "I wondered if I could pick your brain for new ideas." Ginny shrugged, relaxing a little. "As long as you aren't doing so literally, sure." "What's up?" "Well," Rigel said slowly, aware that this was a delicate topic for the second year. "When that construct had you imprisoned in your mind." "Careful, Rigel," Ginny said sharply. "Pretend it was the other way around," Rigel said quickly. "Imagine you were trying to imprison something, him, or anything similar, really, in your mind." "Why?" Ginny frowned, looking uncomfortable. "Just for the sake of the exercise," Rigel said, shrugging off the question for the moment. "How would you do it?" "I mean, you have experience being on the other end of it, so I thought you would have good ideas on what you would do. What kinds of safeguards you would put into place, that kind of thing." "Rigel. What are you doing?" Ginny leaned forward and lowered her voice. "If you're trying to build your own construct I will personally poke your idiot eyes out." "I'm not," Rigel promised. Remember I talked to you last year about building a guardian for my mind. Something semi-autonomous that would take the place of active occlumency in a pinch." "I remember telling you it was a terrible idea," Ginny hissed. "Have you learned nothing?" "I have," Rigel said, mildly offended. "I've put lots of restrictions on it, based on what I've learned. And that's why I'm asking you, to see what you learned, and if it's different than what I thought of." Ginny looked sour, but said, "What have you done so far?" "Well," Rigel said, a bit excited to be talking about her personal project with someone else, "I've already got a form for it, kind of a hollow shell that I'm planning on making autonomous." "How?" Ginny broke in, frowning fiercely. "I'll get to that," Rigel said, "it's theoretical. Anyway, I gave the construct a form like a human, so that it could move around the mindscape, and fool an intruder into thinking it was me if necessary. I knew there were areas that I didn't want it to have access to, though, in case it could be influenced by an intruder and, I don't know, turned against me or something. So I altered the defenses around other areas of my mind, specifically those containing my magic, my consciousness, and my memories. I figured there wasn't much damage it could do to me, that way, but it would still be able to fight off anything that came into my mind from the outside." Ginny nodded slowly. "That's good. But you can't only think of yourself. The mists aren't only an entrance, they can be an exit, too." That's how real legilimens get in and out of other people's heads. If you're going to create something even potentially dangerous, you better make sure it can't leave your head and get into someone else's. Rigel blinked, taken aback by that idea. I didn't think of that at all. I don't know legilimency. Do you really think something I created would have any way of figuring it out if I don't have the knowledge myself? You said you were making it semi-autonomous, Ginny said, eyebrows lifted challengingly. Doesn't that mean a basic level of sentience? You're right, Rigel frowned. I'll have to build a perimeter of some kind to keep it in. That will take some time, but maybe I can work it into a first line of defense to keep others out, too. That would be fairly efficient. What about the parts of your mind that control physical movement? Ginny asked. It might be able to control your body even if your consciousness was out of its reach. Rigel considered that. The physical ties to the body are all over the mindscape. I couldn't block off its access to all of them without severely limiting its usefulness. I don't think it would be able to take over my body if my consciousness was free, though. I have the stronger tie to my physical self than an outside presence, after all. It isn't an outside presence, Ginny said pointedly. It'll be an extension of you, right? Exactly, Rigel said, a part of me. I think it's unlikely to try and do anything that might destroy itself. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can trust all the parts of yourself, Ginny said darkly. You're a teenager. Inevitably there will be parts of you that are dumb, self-absorbed, and contemplate world domination. Rigel winced. She wanted to say not every teenaged Slytherin boy is like Tom Riddle, but she wasn't sure Ginny would believe her. That, and her concerns weren't exactly unfounded. Just because she personally didn't have any interest in power or subjugation didn't mean a semi-sentient creation might not develop its own interests. I'll just have to make sure it's not an independent entity, she said, thinking hard. Tie it to my will, so that even if it can think for itself, it can't do anything contrary to what I want. How to design something like that, though? Tie it to your commands, not just your will, Ginny suggested, also deep in thought. Sometimes your desires can be conflicting, and that might give it leeway somehow. Make it so that it can only act within the perimeter of specific jobs or orders you give it. It can still respond creatively, but only along a prescribed track of goal-oriented behavior. And make it logically consistent, so that it can't respond to the command protect my mind in any way except ones that will ultimately protect your mind. Make sense? Yes, Rigel said, tapping her fingers on the table idly. I'll have to design a whole chain of commands, to keep it appropriately bound. It will take time, but I can probably borrow from other sources. Typical formats for magical oaths, maybe. And records of command sequences others have used. Semi-sentient objects aren't that uncommon, after all. Except most people don't make them in their own heads. Ginny rolled her eyes. I still think this is a bad idea, but I'm not your moth. She froze for half an instant after saying that, half poised to apologize for the slip, but apparently decided to just keep going instead. Well. You should ask Percy for help, if you're determined to be stupid. He's been studying all kinds of wizarding lore this year, looking into future career options. Barristers have to come up with airtight contracts all the time, right? He should be able to help with the wording, once you get what you want figured out. Good idea, Rigel said, making a mental note to do just that. She really wanted this project to work. She had so many theories about how mental magic operated, and so many things she wanted to try, if she could get this up and running. For instance, could she treat the construct like a second consciousness, of sorts? Give it selective information and then ask it to solve a particular problem. That would be fascinating. She'd be able to simulate an objective opinion inside her own head. And what if she could store data in the construct, like a backup brain in case one of her memories was obliterated? The possibilities were endless, really. How are you going to give it sentience, anyway? Ginny asked, reluctantly curious. It takes years sometimes to design sentient spells complex enough to seem lifelike. Rigel smiled. I have an interesting theory, actually. You know how when magical folk give birth a tiny part of the mother's core breaks off and grows into the child's core? I think maybe I could take a piece of my raw magic and put it into the construct. Magic has a certain amount of its own willpower, so that, combined with complex command chains, might be enough to give it its own sort of impetus. Wild magic may have its own will sometimes, but the magic in you has only your will, Ginny said, frowning slightly. I think that would only give you a vessel that you could command with your will, which now that I think of it would actually be pretty useful. You might get good enough at controlling it that you wouldn't have to be meditating to direct it, which means it could be doing some activity that normally you would have to be present in your mind to accomplish. There aren't many tasks like that, but you could direct it to build something, maybe. Ginny shrugged, looking bored again. Let me know if you get anywhere with it. I've got to get back to my essay. Rigel thanked her for all her help and left her to it. She had a lot to think about, but she was feeling optimistic. The experimenter in her couldn't wait to see if her theories panned out. She reminded herself that she couldn't let her enthusiasm outpace her caution, but couldn't bring herself to be too worried. Talking to Ginny had only cemented the idea that, with the proper precautions, getting her construct up and running was a project worth her energy. -0. HP. -0. After Madame Pomfrey had heard what happened at the New Year's Eve gala, her healing classes had taken on an intensity that had previously been absent. The older woman had muttered something uncomplimentary about young people who thought they were fully qualified at something just because they'd read a few books on the subject, and determined that if Rigel was going to be healing real people so much sooner than the nurse had anticipated, then at least no one would be able to say she hadn't taught him well. As such, her lessons had been running longer than usual, with Pomfrey packing as much information into each session as the madam possibly could. The nurse had also taken to insisting that Rigel practice on human subjects when it was possible, as in the case of diagnostic spells and charms. Unfortunately, that was also where they ran into a bit of a snag. You cannot understand what the reading should look like if you haven't seen it on a healthy person, Madame Pomfrey said, exasperated. This charm is much more in-depth than the ones we've been working with, and that means the information it gives is both more complicated and harder to interpret correctly. I've already cast it on you, Rigel said, a stubborn tilt to her chin. And now you must cast it on yourself, Pomfrey said, hands on her hips. A male reading differs on a number of levels from a female's. There will be differences due to our different ages and medical histories, too, and it's important that you be able to pinpoint where in the output they occur. I don't want to, Rigel said, trying to be as firm as possible. Why on earth not? Pomfrey finally demanded. She frowned at Rigel's silence, adding, in a softer tone, what on earth is wrong, child? I just don't want to, Rigel said, shrugging uncomfortably. Don't I have a right to refuse? Doesn't any patient, she added, attempting to look at least a little less suspicious. Yes, of course, Pomfrey sighed, but why? It's personal, Rigel said, unblinking. What would I do, then, if a patient refused to be diagnosed? That is an interesting question, Pomfrey said, allowing herself to be distracted with a modicum of grace. It depends on what, exactly, the patient has refused, the diagnostic spell itself, or treatment in general. People can refuse treatment. Rigel said, surprised. I mean, for optional operations, sure, but for life-saving procedures. They can. She did not look at all approving of such a thing. Any patient has the right to refuse any or all aspects of healing, even if it would save their life. The only exception is when the patient is with child. In some cases, the parent would not have the option to refuse healing that would benefit the child, as long as it created no risk to the carrier. What about children themselves? Rigel asked. Children cannot refuse care until they are 11, old enough to have a wand, old enough to self-determine matters of their own health, or so says the law, Madame Pomfrey explained. The disgruntlement was clear in her tone as she said, as a medicwizard you must bow to the wishes of your patients, even if it is not the course of action you would endorse. Rigel laughed quietly. You don't bow much to the whims of your patients, if I may say so, madam. Pomfrey sniffed. My patients sometimes don't speak loudly enough for me to hear. And many of them don't know that they have the right to refuse, poor dears. Were you a Slytherin? Rigel asked, amused. I'll never tell, she said primly. Now come. You can do the charm again on me, if you insist, and I will attempt to explain where the differences would be. Some areas of information you must ignore, as they are not applicable to male anatomy. The lesson went on as though nothing unusual had occurred, but Rigel could feel the older woman's eyes on her through the rest of her instruction. Madame Pomfrey might have let the matter go, but she would not, Rigel suspected, forget it. She would have to be especially careful around the matron, from now on. -0. HP. -0. It was early March before her insistent stalking of Peter Pettigrew bore fruit. She was finishing up an essay for Flint in the room of requirement, with the intention to spend the night there, as a pervious version of herself was already sleeping in her dorm room. She'd taken the habit of checking the Marauder's map every so often just to check up on the professor, and this time caught sight of him heading for the library. It was a couple of hours past closing, but that was not unusual for Pettigrew. He spent inordinate amounts of time reading in the restricted section, if you could call paging feverishly through tables of contents reading, at least. Rigel ought to know, as it wouldn't be the first time she'd followed him there to try and get a look at what books he was looking through. So far, she didn't know anything except that Pettigrew didn't appear to have any idea what he was looking for. That, or he was completely pants at research of any kind. She put aside the essay and fished out her invisibility cloak, pulling it on with a tired yawn and promising herself she'd sleep a full 10 hours that night. The halls were silent as she made her way toward the library, avoiding ghosts and patrolling prefects deftly. The door to the library was unlocked, as Pettigrew was there before her, so all she had to do was sneak in quietly and close it soundlessly behind her. The trick would be getting out before Pettigrew relocked it. The other night she was almost certain he'd felt the displacement of air as she slipped out just behind him. Pettigrew carried a fairly bright lamp to read by, so it wasn't particularly difficult to see where he was. By the books on magical compulsions again, she thought. She was coming to know the layout of the restricted section rather well, from all the hopping around Pettigrew did while she observed him. He was sweating slightly in the light of the lamp as he shakily turned page after page, muttering anxiously to himself as he was wont to. After a short time, he sighed despairingly with a murmured, "No, no, no. This isn't it at all." He reshelved the book and selected another from the same section, seemingly at random. Did he honestly expect that to work? That he'd somehow just come across the answer by luck or through sheer probability if he searched through enough books? The short man looked so hopelessly lost that she almost felt sorry for him. A sound from the hallway outside the library echoed through the dark stacks just then, and Pettigrew froze completely like a frightened animal, clearly spooked. He hastily grabbed an armful of books at random and began scurrying toward the door. Rigel followed silently, wondering how this man had gotten up the gumption to put himself in opposition to such powerful people when he was afraid of his own shadow. He seemed pathetically inept to her. She shook her head in silent self-admonishment. She should know better than to judge by a person's appearance. For all she knew, his bumbling fool routine was an act. Pettigrew's foot caught in the hem of his robe and he sprawled noisily, books tumbling to the floor. In his scramble to pick them up, his knee became tangled in his shoulder bag, and the moment he attempted to stand, the seam split and papers fluttered into the air around his dismayed expression of stupor. It could be a very good act, she supposed dubiously as the man fumbled and muttered as he attempted to collect all the books and papers that had spilled. Halfway through, he realized he ought to repair his bag first, and had to put everything down and start again. Rigel shifted her focus impatiently, feeling slightly rude while watching him crawl around so piteously. Her gaze caught onto a piece of parchment covered in scribbled notes, which had floated, unnoticed by Pettigrew, a fair distance further than the other papers. Holding her breath, she crept forward slowly until she was right next to it, then lifted the cloak just enough to drop it quickly over the stray parchment before Pettigrew noticed it. There was a slight rustling noise, but when the creature's professor looked over fearfully, he didn't seem to see anything amiss. He stuffed all the papers away into his newly repaired bag and left at something close to a run, books encumbering him so much that he appeared not to bother locking the library behind him. Sloppy, Rigel thought as she bent to pick up her prize and slip it into her pocket. She locked the door herself on her way out, and made her way quickly back to the come-and-go room. Once situated comfortably, she took out the scrap of notes that she'd claimed and swiftly perused it. There was a passage of some kind written out shakily at the top of the parchment. It looked like prose of some kind, or perhaps a poem. Underneath, and filling up the edges of every margin, was a collection of scribbled notes and half-formed ideas that were apparently Pettigrew's attempts to decipher the paragraph at the top. Wondering what had been so important for him to figure out, Rigel began to read the passage carefully. If dominion is desired, domination is required. Tilde ere the moment be expired. To reach for self-same power is to see creation cower. Tilde or to find oneself devoured. The birds and beasts and flowers will conspire through the hours. Tilde to contend these rising powers. So if supremacy you seek, look to reign beyond the weak. Tilde else your destiny be bleak. Master yourself, master the other. Take control or be took by another. Keep power alive, yet under control. Dominion will answer, transforming the soul. Ascend and rule, but bear the cost. Beware what comes of power lost. She rubbed her eyes tiredly after reading it through twice. Well, that wasn't cryptic at all, she thought sourly. She'd always found riddles incredibly annoying. She preferred less oblique means of communication, herself. She could start with the structure, though. There was something about the rhyme scheme that she thought was important. She looked tiredly over the passage, noting the two juxtaposed meter systems and counting the lines in each. 4 lines of tripled rhymes followed by 3 rhyming couplets. 7 rhyming units total, a number of power, the arithmancy student in her noted. Where had she heard about magical prose? Sometime talking to Pansy, she thought, racking her mind for the memory. Her blonde friend had mentioned the importance of rhyming schemes in relation to one of her homework assignments. It hadn't been an assignment she shared with Rigel, which meant it was for one of her other extracurricular classes. But which one? Divination or care of magical creatures? After a sleepy attempt to recall the details of the brief conversation, she remembered where she was and asked the room politely for a book on the technical aspects of magical poems and prose. An incredibly dense tome landed in her lap with a cloud of dust that sent her into a brief sneezing fit. Rigel paged through the book to the chapter that dealt with identifying pieces of magical literature by their structure. She skipped over the sections on identifying spells, chants, vows, summonings, and various other rituals, eventually finding a section on divination that looked promising. It was a prophecy, she groaned in belated realization, or something very close to one. It followed exactly the pattern set by the book to be favored by Centauran foretellers. According to the short paragraph the author offered on the 7-part rhyme scheme, it wasn't a true prediction of the future, more a prophetic collection of knowledge pertaining to an unknown subject. Centaurs weren't as reliable as human seers when it came to predicting specific moments or events, but they could read general information on a broad range of topics from the stars. Still, where had Pettigrew found such a passage? As far as Rigel knew, centaurs rarely gave prophetic advice to wizards, and, unlike human seers, almost never consented to their predictions being recorded. Even the book she had open on her knees referenced the rhyming structure as an oral pattern of conveyance. The bed in the corner of the room was calling to her, but she knew she should at least make an attempt to figure the passage out before going to bed. It would only keep her awake if she didn't. It was definitely about the Dominion jewel, aside from the fact that she'd taken it from Pettigrew, who couldn't be researching anything else. The word Dominion was capitalized on the paper. Wait, if it was a centaur foretelling, then how would there be capitalized words? Were they arbitrary, or a true reflection of the inflection given by the original speaker? Rigel supposed ruefully she had no way of knowing, so she would take the capitals as important on faith, for now. Scanning the verses for any other obvious conclusions, she grimaced slightly. There was a lot of mention of controlling things and dominating and mastering and reigning, that didn't bode well. Neither did the ominous warnings about being devoured and the explicit mention of cost. In her experience any magic that referenced sacrifice so blatantly was either powerful, dangerous, or a potent combination of both. All right, let's take it line by line, she thought with resignation. Why couldn't Pettigrew have accidentally dropped a passage with very explicit directions on how to neutralize the jewel's power, or maybe a map to where he was hiding it? The part about desiring dominion seemed clear enough, it was introducing the requirements for using the jewel. Domination being necessary wasn't entirely surprising, though she had to wonder if Pettigrew met that qualification at all. The moment be expired part was promising, too. If there was some kind of time limit, then maybe Pettigrew wouldn't be able to gain the power he sought before it was reached. He had looked pretty panicked for time while going through library books. Creation in capitalized form probably just meant everything she supposed, and she didn't like the dichotomy the second line seemed to be setting up. Make everything cower before you or end up devoured yourself. What an awful set of alternatives. The birds, beasts, and flowers part was obvious. Even Pettigrew had made a note in the margins about how the creatures around Hogwarts had reacted to its use. So they, at least, recognized the power the jewel offered as a negative thing. That in itself should dissuade anyone from trying to use it, Rigel thought. Magical creatures rarely agreed upon anything, and that was when they involved themselves outside of their own communities in the first place. The so in the line directly after that worried her, though. It seemed to indicate a continuation of the line before it, which would put the birds, beasts, and flowers in direct juxtaposition to the weak. What did that mean? That one should only reign over strong magical creatures? Or that it would not be enough to reign over weak things? She supposed it would belly the whole Dominion idea if the wielder settled for using it on petty things, but why would that be important enough to include in the verse? Master yourself, master the other, she read again. But was that sequential or conditional? Which were you supposed to do first? Take control or have it taken by another? That seemed like a warning that if you didn't use the jewel someone else might. What a power-hungry, paranoid thing to worry about. She had no idea what keeping power alive meant, nor why that mention of power in particular was capitalized. As far as she knew, you couldn't kill power. The next line about the jewel actually transforming the soul of the one who used it was equally ominous. That made it sound like the jewel had a deep effect on the one who used it. The last couplet wasn't any better. Bearing the cost was in line with what she knew about truly powerful magic, but she would have thought the warning would be about the dangers and responsibilities that come with power, not about what might happen if you lost the power. There was so much vagueness about power and control in different forms. It almost seemed like a general warning against being weak, without any concrete information on how to actually use the jewel. Judging by the disjointed, frustrated notes all over the page, that fact had been infuriating Pettigrew to no end. Her brain was protesting violently in the form of a headache that throbbed in time with her heartbeat, so Rigel set the parchment carefully aside and decided to call it a night. She could pore over it more tomorrow, for all the good it would do her. She wasn't any closer to getting the proof she needed. How nice it would have been if Pettigrew put his name in the upper right corner of all his notes like Theo did. Chuckling a bit at the image of the beady-eyed man carefully signing all his incriminating research notes, Rigel drifted off into a deep, bone-weary sleep. -0. AB. -0. With Hermione's recent and rather persistent habit of considering looks, leading questions, and expectant expressions, Archie had seen this confrontation coming for a while. He'd been dreading it, fully aware that she'd somehow become suspicious of something, but unable to redirect her conclusions without being able to figure out what she thought she knew. Nothing he'd imagined in all his panicked scenarios had prepared him for this, however. They were outside at their usual spot, and Archie was sure that if he hadn't already been sitting on the grass beneath their shady tree, he would have fallen over in shock. "You, come again." "I said I know," Hermione said, somehow looking both apologetic and impatient at once. "I know you're a girl." "I'm not," Archie tried, weakly. Her accusation, while false and somewhat humorous, still betrayed a dangerous amount of knowledge. How could she have come to that conclusion without knowing something? Hermione sighed, and managed to summon a very disappointed look that Archie was pretty sure they only taught people with small children. "I've known for months. I've been waiting for you to tell me, but I realized you weren't ever going to, so I'm telling you now." "Months?" Archie croaked. "How, exactly did you come to this conclusion?" "My parents got me a subscription to the Daily Prophet for Christmas," Hermione said, gazing pityingly at him, as though he ought to have guessed how she knew. "I saw the article they did on the gala the Sow party hosted. It said that someone had almost died there, and then mentioned that your dad was head of the minister's security detail. I was perplexed, because it went on to say that Harry Potter's own daughter was one of the 2 people who saved the life of the man who was attacked. I was so confused, Harry, because I knew you had a little sister but you'd never mentioned any other siblings." Hermione was rambling now, the words spilling out quickly and almost pleadingly. I went to the British Ministry and tried to look up some information about your dad, thinking maybe he had a child from a previous marriage you hadn't told me about, only they don't let citizens access ministry personnel records, apparently, so I had to go through the individual genealogy records kept by the ministry's Department of Magical Heritage. Did you know your family is in the Book of Gold? The last was said with a demanding glare, which Archie was too distracted to cower appropriately before. Yes, he said, swallowing roughly. Those records aren't always updated correctly, though. Don't bother, Hermione huffed. Even after I saw your entry written as Harriet Potter in the Book of Gold, I wasn't entirely certain. So I went to the Bureau of Magical Land Management and talked my way into looking at the estate records by saying I was doing very important research about the conservation of folded space for wizarding wildlife. You shouldn't lie to ministry officials, Archie croaked. Don't you dare talk to me about lying right now, Harry, Hermione hissed. Guess who the Potter estate is currently entailed to? The heiress Harriet Potter, eldest daughter to the current lord. She folded her arms triumphantly and waited with raised eyebrows for him to collect his thoughts. It wasn't a disaster. She hadn't accused him of anything awful, yet, like being someone else entirely. So she knew Harry was a girl. Harry was a girl, and it wasn't like that was really a secret, back home, anyway. Looking at her pouting lips, Archie suspected Hermione was more concerned with the idea that he'd been lying to her for 2.5 years than with wondering why. That's very impressive, deducing, Archie offered, smiling in a transparent attempt to lighten the air between them. Hermione's face only darkened. You lied to me, Harry. To everyone here. Do you know how stupid I felt once I'd figured it out? You're not stupid, Archie exclaimed, feeling suddenly awful. I know that, Hermione snapped, and yet I somehow missed all the signs leading up to this. How your letters were always addressed to Harriet, how you had to explain to even the teachers at the beginning of first year that your dad was just playing a joke on them, but he wasn't, this whole time. You were the one playing the joke. It wasn't a joke, he said quietly. And how you never invited me over to meet your family or let me stay to meet them at the airport, even though you've met mine half a dozen times, Hermione went on, working herself up into a real rant. He supposed she'd been bottling it in for a while. And how you flirt outrageously with everyone you meet because you're overcompensating for the fact that you're not really a boy. Archie didn't suppose she was in the mood to hear that that was a genuine part of his personality. Were you ever going to tell me? Hermione asked, her eyes slightly wet with suppressed hurt. Archie had never felt more a cad, but he didn't know how he could fix things without jeopardizing everything he and Harry had been working for. If it was just his dream, maybe he could give it up for Hermione's friendship and understanding. Harry's dreams were everything to her, though. He could never betray their ruse like that. Not even for his best friend. Somehow, he would have to improvise and hope that Hermione was as wonderful as he thought she was. I didn't want you to think of me like that, Archie said after some quick thinking. The only way out of this was to invoke Hermione's sense of compassion. If I told you I was a girl, pretending to be a boy, you'd always treat me as some kind of imposter, instead of understanding who I really am. You. Hermione's concentration was beautiful as she tried to follow the trail he was laying down. You don't identify as a girl. It's always been a struggle for me to feel like I belonged in my own skin, Archie said, trying to squash the feeling of incredibly guilt he felt at misleading her like this. I thought, coming here, it would be like a fresh start. I could be the person I want to be, instead of who I was born. That much, at least, was true. And Harry was a bit of a tomboy, so he wasn't stretching reality too much. Don't you think it would be better to come to terms with yourself, rather than try and suppress parts of it? Hermione asked, frowning concernedly now. That was good, he told himself. If she was worried about him, she would be less likely to think up more sinister reasons he might have for hiding his gender. I've been working on it, he lied. Time to set some groundwork, and wouldn't Harry be proud? She was always telling him to think ahead. Maybe one day I can go back to being a girl. For now, though, I'm more comfortable like this. Does it really bother you so much? It bothers me that you lied about it, Hermione said, eyes narrowed. He could tell most of her anger had bled away once she felt she had an adequate explanation, though. Have you even talked with your parents about it? Not exactly, Archie grimaced. That would certainly be awkward. Well, you should, Hermione said firmly. It's not healthy to bottle things up like this. I'm sure your parents would understand and work through it with you. This is actually very common, you know. I've read about it in several reputable psychology books. Of course you have, Archie said, smiling fondly. I must say, I didn't consider that you might actually feel more comfortable this way, Hermione said, frowning. I should have thought of it. I was thinking maybe you'd done it as a big joke, or maybe as some sort of attempt to avoid sexist discrimination in the future. I know you've mentioned there's some unfairness in certain wizarding industries still, and I was prepared to lecture you sternly on how wrong it is to avoid the issue yourself while everyone else in your situation is still subjected to unfairness, because you have to fight for change, of course, but, well, I'm glad that wasn't it, Hermione finished, smiling sheepishly. Archie kept a bland expression on his face through force of will, but he could feel his insides curling up in shame. Hermione's assessment had been, once again, too close for comfort. He could only imagine how angry and disappointed she would be if she knew that he was doing exactly what she'd feared, and worse, because the issue he and Harry were skirting was blood prejudice, which Hermione already felt very strongly about fighting against. It amazed him, how mature she was. The idea that their duplicity tacitly endorsed the unfair system they were circumventing in the first place would have never occurred to Archie without someone pointing it out, but of course it was far too late to do anything about it now. He would just have to look for other ways to atone, if he could. Perhaps once he was himself again, he could use what influence the Blacks had left to bolster Hermione's campaign. If I may ask, Hermione said after a moment, how do you look like a boy? I can't see the girl in you even now that I know to look for it. Is that natural? Is this why you made me steal all the polyjuice in first year? I still never saw you taking any. If it is natural, what are you going to do in a few years when you fill out and it'll be obvious to anyone? Take a breath, Myan, Archie said, lips quirking a bit. If she was already starting to think of how he'd hide his gender in the future, then it looked like she was planning to stay friends after all. He wasn't sure he should tell her much more, at first, but then realized that if they were going to be friends till they graduated, it would be very suspicious to Hermione if he never started looking like a girl. I have to swear you to secrecy, Hermione, he said, lips tightening. Yeah, okay. Hermione rolled her eyes. I'm serious, Archie said. He held her gaze for a long second, to make sure she understood how earnest he was. I won't make you swear a binding oath. As if I would agree to something so reckless. But you must promise me solemnly to never tell anyone what I'm about to tell you, he concluded. Hermione bit her lip. I suppose, you're not really hurting anyone. Her expression revealed the furious debate taking place inside her head, but in the end she sighed gustily. Fine, but after this you are not getting rid of me, Harriet Potter. We are in this together. Nothing would please me more, Archie said, smiling widely. Then. I promise not to tell anyone what you tell me about pretending to be a boy. I won't even tell anyone that you are pretending, if you don't want, though I maintain that you should talk to your parents about this, Hermione said. Noted, Archie said dryly. He gathered his courage, then said, I'm a metamorph. It means I can. I know what it is, Hermione breathed, eyes widening. That's so rare, Harry. I read it was only common to a couple of wizarding families. It runs in the Black line, Archie told her, and my grandmother was a Black. I haven't told anyone, though, not my family, not anyone. But it's how I live as a boy. So, this isn't what you really look like? Hermione asked, looking perturbed. Not really, Archie said wryly. She really had no idea. She said, taking it in slowly. It's almost a fateful coincidence that you would harbor such confusion about your inner self and then be given the means to manipulate your outer self, don't you think? Have there been studies of other metamorph magi? Maybe the feeling uncomfortable in your skin thing is a side effect of the ability, a natural adaptation of the brain, perhaps, or, well, I suppose I could look into it. Archie was amazed, as always, at the way Hermione's brain worked. Just so you know, you could have told me sooner, Hermione said, tilting her head at him admonishingly. My family happens to be very progressive. I'll keep that in mind, Archie laughed, fully relaxing at last. Everything was going to be okay. His relief lasted until he realized that Harry would have to be informed of this development. He could feel the blood draining from his face immediately. She was not going to like this. And somehow, he was certain, it would end up being